medieval emergency fixes that became how we do things forever. You look at the Middle Ages, and it is so easy to see it the way we always have. A time of superstition, of helplessness, of people just waiting for the plague to take them while they pray in the dark. But if you actually dig into the ground and look at the records, a completely different picture emerges. It was a risk society, just like ours. And when disaster hit, whether it was water, disease, or fire, they didn't just pray, they improvised. And the crazy thing is, the things they threw together in a panic, the emergency fixes, those became the foundations of the modern world. Let's start with the water. If you lived in a city in the 1300s, your biggest fear might be the river. In 1333, Florence got destroyed by a flood. Now think about what we assume about medieval people. They'd see this as the wrath of God and just take it. But they didn't. The city authorities, right after the water receded, did something shockingly modern. They formed an emergency committee. They gave tax relief to the victims. They organized food drops to people stranded by the water. And most importantly, they built a temporary bridge over the Arno just to get the city moving again. But it's the Netherlands where this really became a permanent mindset. Before 1280, places like Holland and Utrecht realized they were losing the battle to the sea one farm at a time. Their emergency fix was centralization. They realized that a dike is only as strong as its weakest link. And if one farmer let his section fail, everyone drowned. So they created central water boards. They centralized the management of the dikes. It was a crisis response that became a permanent system of government. And when the water won anyway, they had food storage systems that were genius. Monasteries built these massive barns. They stored unthreshed grain because it lasted longer. Cities had civic granaries. They spread the burden of loss over time, so a bad harvest didn't mean instant mass death. It was disaster relief, medieval style. Then came the really big one, the Black Death. Venice in the 1340s was ground zero. They had no idea what germs were. They had no idea how it spread. They were flying blind. Some people thought it was a punishment from God, so they whipped themselves. Others put bricks in the mouths of the dead to stop them from chewing their way out of coffins. That's the kind of fear we imagine. But the Venetians, the city government, they did something else. They looked at the evidence they had. They saw that contact with the sick seemed to matter. So they improvised a solution that made no sense in their medieval understanding of the world, but worked perfectly. They created quarantine. In 1432, they built the first lazaretto on an island. It was a hospital, but it was essentially a prison for the sick and anyone arriving on ships. They held them there for 40 days, 40 giorni, just to see if they would die. If they lived, they could come in. That word, quarantine, is just the Italian word for 40. It was a random number. It was a guess. But that emergency guess, that improvisation to stop a disease they couldn't see, became the bedrock of global public health. It is the reason we isolated during COVID. It started as a desperate guess on an island in Venice. And it wasn't just isolation. They invented the hazmat suit. Doctors wore these beak masks. They stuffed the beak with vinegar and herbs. They thought it would purify the bad air, the miasma. It didn't stop germs, but it was the first attempt at a respirator, at personal protective equipment. It was a desperate fix that created the entire concept of protective medical gear. While the Italians were figuring out disease, they were also figuring out money. Because the Middle Ages had a massive economic problem. They literally ran out of metal. There wasn't enough gold and silver in Europe to mint coins for all the new trade happening. If you were a merchant, shipping coins across roads full of bandits was suicide. So they invented the bill of exchange. You would deposit your coins with a banker in Venice. He would give you a piece of paper. You would travel to Bruges, hand that paper to his contact there, and get your money out. That paper was the first paper money. It was an emergency workaround for a metal shortage, and it became the entire basis of modern finance. By 1300, this was the normal way to do business. And they formalized how we work together. They invented the compagnie, the permanent partnership. They invented the contract. The Hanseatic League, which was basically a gang of German trading towns, started with a simple contract between Hamburg and Lübeck in 1241 for mutual protection. That piece of paper, that agreement, grew into an economic alliance that controlled Northern Europe for centuries. They even created factories, foreign trading posts where their factors, agents, lived. It's where we get the word factory. They even solved the morality of money. The church said charging interest, usury, was a sin. You couldn't make money just from lending money. You had to work. So the merchants invented the bill of exchange to hide the interest in the exchange rate. And they invented the partnership. If I invest in your voyage, I'm not charging you interest. I'm taking a share of the risk. If the ship sinks, I lose everything. Because it was risky, it wasn't usury. It was an investment. It was a loophole, an emergency exit from religious law. It created the venture capital model we still use. And in the forests, peasants were doing the same thing with land. In Provence, they needed farmland, but the good land was owned by lords, so they did slash and burn farming. They'd clear a patch of forest, burn it for fertilizer, farm it for a few years until the soil was dead, and then move on. They built temporary huts. It was illegal squatting, really. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of them stopped moving. They liked that spot. They made the huts permanent. They turned temporary cultivation into permanent settlements. The local authorities fought it, but the peasants kept doing it. It was civil disobedience through architecture. A temporary emergency measure, farming poor land to survive, became a way of permanently claiming land and building new communities. And in the churches, something similar was happening with sound. For centuries, music was just one line, plain chant, monks singing in unison. But at some point, some singer got bored, or maybe he just couldn't find the note. He started singing a different note at the same time. Maybe he sang a fifth above or a fourth below. It was parallel. It was simple. They called it organum. Then they started to embellish. They couldn't just sing one note against the chant anymore. They wanted to show off. They started singing 50 notes against one held note in the chant. The chant had to slow down to a crawl to accommodate this improvisation. The tenor line, the hold, became just a drone. This was the Notre Dame School in Paris. These improvisers, singers like Léonin, were so good that someone eventually wrote their improvisations down. They composed the music by notating the improvisation. That became the first real composed polyphony. And then the English changed the rules. They loved the sound of thirds and sixths, what we now call sweet harmony. The Continentals thought this was sloppy, but the English improvised this way constantly. They called it cantilena, or fabardin. It was an improvised harmony sung by ear, and that sweet sound, that emergency deviation from the perfect intervals, became the basis of all Renaissance music. It led directly to the harmonies of Palestrina and eventually to the pop songs we hear today. Even the troubadours, the rock stars of the Middle Ages, improvised everything. They wrote the words and a vague melody. The instrumentalists, the viol players, had to just make it up. They had to know on the spot how to play an introduction, how to accompany, how to improvise a harmony. It was jazz. And we know they looked to the Arab world for how to do it. The Nuba style of Arabic music became the basis for how Europeans accompanied their songs. It was cultural appropriation, as an emergency fix for a lack of notation. So when you look back, there is no dark ages of stupidity. That was a time when people, faced with drowning, with plagues, with running out of cash, had to think on their feet. They built temporary bridges that became permanent structures. They held ships for 40 days and invented public health. They drew up contracts to protect themselves and invented capitalism. They sang the wrong notes and invented harmony. We don't do things the way we do because some genius designed it that way in a lab. We do it this way because 700 years ago, in a moment of panic, some Venetian official or some bored monk in Paris did the only thing they could think of to survive. And it worked. And we never stopped. You see, the thing about these medieval fixes is that they weren't just about survival. They were about structure. Once they stopped the immediate bleeding, once the flood receded or the plague passed, they realized they'd stumbled onto something useful. Something that made life work better even when things were normal. And that's the part we never talk about. How emergency measures became the default. Let's go back to the water for a second. Those Dutch water boards I mentioned, the waterschappen, they didn't just disappear when the dikes held. They became the model for a local government. These were ordinary farmers and burghers getting together to decide who paid for what, who maintained which section, what the penalties were for neglect. It was democracy from the ground up, born entirely from the fear of drowning in your sleep. When the rest of Europe was still feudal with lords and serfs, the Netherlands had functional local governance because the water forced them to cooperate or die. And that idea spread. When cities elsewhere had fires, which happened constantly, because everything was wood and straw, they remembered what the Dutch did with water. In London, after the Great Fire of 1666, sure, they rebuilt with brick and stone. But they also created the first real building codes. They standardized street widths. They mandated fire breaks. It was regulation, thick and heavy, all because one emergency taught them that letting people build whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted, was a death sentence for the whole city. Every building code you follow today, every permit you pull, traces back to a pile of ash that used to be a city. Now think about disease again. Quarantine worked. But the Venetians realized it only worked if you knew who was sick and where they were going. So they invented health passes. In 1377, in the Republic of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, they started issuing tickets to travelers. If you came from a plague-free area, you got a paper that said so. If you didn't have one, you sat on that island for 40 days. It was the first passport. Not for national identity and not for patriotism, for disease control. A temporary document to stop a temporary crisis became the permanent way we prove who we are at borders. And the hospitals? Before the plague, hospitals were mostly run by monks and nuns. They were places of charity, not really medicine. You went there to die with dignity, not to get better. But after the plague, cities realized that if they didn't do something about the sick, the economy would collapse. So they took over. They created civic hospitals. They hired doctors. They paid them salaries. They turned healing into a public responsibility instead of a religious favor. Every public health system in the world owes something to that shift. Then there's the legal system. Because if you're going to have trade, you need courts. And medieval courts were a mess. Trial by combat, trial by ordeal, all that superstition stuff. But merchants couldn't wait for God to decide who owed what. They needed answers now. So they created their own courts. The pie powder courts, from the French pied poudre, dusty feet, were held right at the markets. If a deal went bad, you went before the court. They heard the case right there, and they settled it before the market closed. No waiting, no ordeals, just business sense. These courts ignored the old feudal laws. They used law merchant, the customs of merchants themselves. If everyone in a certain trade always did it a certain way, that became the rule. It was common law made by the people who actually did the work. And when those cases piled up, when the same problems kept coming back, they started writing them down. That became the lex mercatoria, the merchant law, which is still the basis for international trade today. Every contract dispute that ends up in arbitration, every time a business agrees to binding arbitration instead of court, that's medieval merchants saying, "We can't wait for the king's courts. Let's just solve this ourselves and get back to work." And speaking of getting back to work, let's talk about time. Because the Middle Ages had a massive problem with time. The church rang bells for prayers, matins, lauds, vespers, but those were tied to sunrise and sunset. They moved. An hour in summer was longer than an hour in winter. You couldn't schedule anything. You couldn't say, meet me at 3 o'clock, because 3 o'clock didn't exist. Then the monasteries, always obsessed with getting their prayers exactly right, started tinkering with water clocks, then mechanical clocks. By the 1300s, big cities were putting clocks in towers, not for the public, for themselves, to know when to start work and stop work. But the public saw them, heard them, and wanted them. The first public clocks were status symbols. Look at us. We have a clock. We're important. But here's the emergency part. The clocks were unreliable. They ran fast. They ran slow. They needed constant adjustment. So the clockmakers, these new professionals, developed ways to regulate them. The verge escapement, the foliot, later the pendulum. Every time the clock drifted, they invented something to fix it. And those fixes, those tiny engineering solutions to keep time accurate, became the basis for all precision mechanics. The entire Industrial Revolution, every machine that runs on precise timing, starts with a monk trying not to pray at the wrong hour and a city trying to look modern. Now let's go back to the peasants for a moment, because they weren't just squatting on land. They were managing it in ways we still use. The three-field system, plant one field, rest one field, graze animals on the third, that was an emergency response to soil exhaustion. They realized that farming the same ground every year killed the dirt, so they rotated. They let fields lie fallow. They spread manure. They invented crop rotation out of pure desperation, because they were starving and needed the land to keep producing. And when the climate changed, when the medieval warm period ended and things got colder and wetter, they adapted again. They moved to higher ground. They changed what they planted. They built better drainage. They didn't have scientists telling them what to do. They just watched, experimented, and passed down what worked. Every farmer today who rotates crops, who tests soil, who adjusts planting times based on weather patterns, is standing on the shoulders of peasants who had no choice but to figure it out or starve. Even the way we fight wars comes from medieval emergencies. Castles were an emergency response to Viking raids. When the Vikings showed up, burned your village, and left before anyone could stop them, you needed a place to hide. So you built a fortress. But the Vikings adapted. They learned to besiege. So the castles got bigger, thicker, more elaborate. They developed concentric walls, murder holes, all that stuff. Then gunpowder showed up, and suddenly stone walls were useless. So the engineers improvised again. They lowered the walls, made them thicker, angled them to deflect cannonballs. Star forts, tres Italiens. Every military fortification, from the 1500s until today, is just a medieval castle trying to survive gunpowder. And the guns themselves? The first cannons were literally bells. When the Chinese invented gunpowder, Europeans took the idea and looked around for something to shoot it out of. They had bell foundries, bronze bells. So they took a bell, pointed it at the enemy, stuffed it with powder and rocks, and lit it. It exploded half the time, but when it worked, it worked. The entire firearms industry starts with a bell maker saying, "Well, this is sort of like a bell, right?" An emergency weapon became the standard. Every gun you've ever seen, every artillery piece, is a descendant of a church bell pointed at someone you didn't like. Even shipbuilding. The Vikings built longships, fast, shallow, perfect for raiding. But they were terrible for cargo. So when trade picked up, someone in Northern Europe took the Viking design and made it fatter, deeper, rounder, the cog. It was ugly, it was slow, but it could carry tons of grain or wine or wool. And it had a rudder on the back instead of a steering oar on the side. That was the emergency fix. They needed better control in rough seas, so they put the rudder in the middle where it wouldn't break. That rudder, that medieval improvisation, is on every boat you've ever been on. And the compass? The Europeans got it from the Arabs, who got it from the Chinese. But the Chinese used it for fortune-telling. The Arabs used it for navigation in the featureless desert. The Europeans used it to sail out of sight of land. That was the emergency. They'd run out of coastline. They needed to cross open water to get to the Baltic grain or the English wool. So they took the compass, stuck it in a box, added a card with the winds marked on it, and started sailing where no one had sailed before. Every GPS, every satellite navigation, is just a better way of doing what a medieval sailor did, with a magnetized needle floating in a bowl of water. And think about books. Before the printing press, books were handwritten. Monks in scriptoria, copying by hand, one at a time. It took months. It cost a fortune. Only churches and rich people had them. Then paper showed up, from China via the Arabs, and suddenly you had something cheaper than parchment. But you still had to write it by hand. The emergency was demand. Too many people wanted books, and not enough monks could write them fast enough. So the universities, another medieval invention, by the way, born from the emergency of too many students and not enough teachers, started a new system. They'd have a stationer. He'd get an approved copy of a text, and he'd rent it out in sections. Students would copy it themselves, or the stationer would hire multiple scribes, give each one a different section, and assemble the copies at the end. Piecework. Assembly line. It was mass production before machines, and when Gutenberg came along, he didn't invent printing from scratch. He just mechanized what the stationers were already doing. Every book you've ever read, every PDF, every Kindle, comes from a medieval emergency where there weren't enough monks to write fast enough. And let's not forget the roads. Roman roads were great, straight, solid, built to last. But by the Middle Ages, they'd been neglected for centuries. They were broken, overgrown, dangerous. So when trade picked up, people didn't try to rebuild the Roman roads. Too much work. Instead, they used rivers. They used the sea. They used old drovers' roads, paths that animals had made. They improvised. And when they absolutely had to build a road, they built it for the purpose, to get wool to the port or grain to the city. Not for glory, not for empire, just to move stuff. That utilitarian approach, that good-enough-for-now mentality, is how we still build infrastructure. You build for the need, not for the monument. Even the way we measure things comes from this. Every medieval town had its own weights and measures. A pound in London wasn't the same as a pound in Paris. A bushel here wasn't a bushel there. It was chaos. But merchants couldn't deal with chaos. So they created standards. The Tower pound for money. The Troy pound for gold and silver. They based them on grains of wheat, the weight of a grain, because wheat was everywhere and fairly consistent. That's where we get carrot from, carob seeds. The emergency was trade, and the fix was standardization. Every time you buy a pound of sugar, you're using a measurement that a medieval merchant made up so he wouldn't get cheated. And look at the map. Medieval maps weren't about geography. They were about theology. Jerusalem in the center, Eden at the top, that kind of thing. Useless for navigation. But sailors needed real maps, so they made portolan charts, practical maps showing coastlines, harbors, dangers. They drew lines from port to port, showing directions. They didn't care what was inland. They cared about getting from A to B without hitting a rock. Those maps, those emergency navigation tools, became the basis for all modern cartography. When Columbus sailed, he used portolan charts. When GPS draws you a route, it's doing what a medieval sailor did with a piece of sheepskin and a lot of guesses. And let's talk about money again, because coins were great, but coins were heavy. So when you had to pay the king's tax, you didn't drag coins to London. You used a tally stick. A stick of wood, notched to show the amount, then split lengthwise. The king kept one half, you kept the other. When you paid, they matched the halves. It was a receipt. But it was also currency. You could pay someone else with your half, and they'd trust it because they knew the king's half existed. It was a bond. It was government debt. It was quantitative easing on a stick. The British government used tally sticks until 1826. When they finally burned the old ones in 1834, the fire got out of control and burned down the Houses of Parliament. That's how persistent these medieval fixes are. They literally set the world on fire when we finally tried to get rid of them. And think about the postal system. Messengers were expensive. Only kings and universities had them. But merchants needed to communicate. So they made deals. I'll carry your letter to Bruges if you carry mine to Venice. They created informal networks. They used traveling merchants as couriers. They left messages at specific inns, at specific tables, hoping the right person would come by and pick them up. It was chaos, but it worked. And when the king saw how well it worked, he took it over. The first royal postal systems were just formalized versions of what merchants were already doing. Every letter you've ever mailed, every email you've ever sent, is a descendant of a medieval merchant saying, "Hey, you going to London? Take this for me?" Even the way we learn comes from this. Before universities, if you wanted to learn, you found a master and begged. You apprenticed. You followed them around. It was personal, informal, and efficient. But when cities grew, when more people wanted to learn, that system broke. So the masters got together. They formed guilds, universitas, to control who could teach. They set curricula. They charged fees. They gave degrees, literally a license to teach. It was a monopoly, but it was also standardization. Every college degree you've ever earned, every lecture you've ever sat through, comes from a bunch of medieval teachers in Bologna or Paris saying, "We need to organize this before it gets out of hand." And the books they use, the textbooks, those came from the same place. Someone would give a series of lectures. A student would write it down. Another student would copy it. Eventually, those notes became the standard text. They'd be revised, corrected, expanded. They'd become the sentences of Peter Lombard, or the Summa of Aquinas. They were crowdsourced, open source, constantly updated. Every textbook you've ever used is just a really old, really formalized version of a student's notes from a medieval lecture hall. Now let's go back to the church for a moment. Because the church wasn't just about prayer, it was about record-keeping. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, the church kept track because nobody else did. That was the emergency. How do you know who's related to whom? How do you know if you're allowed to marry someone? You need records. So the church made them. And when the state needed to tax people, when they needed to know who owned what, they went to the church records. Every birth certificate, every marriage license, every census comes from a priest writing down who got baptized last Sunday so he'd know who was in his flock. And the calendar? The church needed to know when Easter was. It's a moving date. First Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox. You can't just guess. You have to calculate. So monks spent centuries figuring out how to calculate it accurately. They developed computus, the science of dating. They argued about it. They wrote books about it. And in doing so, they kept mathematics alive in Europe. Every calendar on your wall, every date in your phone, is a descendant of monks arguing about when to celebrate the resurrection. Even the way we tell time at night comes from this. Before clocks, monks needed to know when to pray. They couldn't see the sun, so they used the stars. They learned which constellations rose at which times and which seasons. They made star charts. They built observatories in churches on towers. They were astronomers because they had to be. Every time you look at the night sky and know what you're seeing, you're doing what a medieval monk did to make sure he didn't sleep through matins. And think about navigation at night. Sailors needed the stars too. They didn't have compasses at first, not reliable ones. So they steered by the North Star. They measured its height to know their latitude. They invented instruments, the astrolabe, the quadrant, to measure it more accurately. Those instruments, those emergency fixes for not knowing where you were, became the basis for all celestial navigation. Every explorer who crossed an ocean used tools that medieval sailors invented because they were scared of getting lost. Now let's talk about something you don't expect: insurance. It sounds modern, but it's medieval. If you're a merchant and you send a ship to Flanders and it sinks, you're ruined. So what do? You spread the risk. You find other merchants to invest in your voyage. You give them a share of the profits if it succeeds, and they accept that they lose their money if it fails. That's a partnership, and we already talked about that. But insurance goes further. In Genoa in the 1300s, they started writing contracts that were pure insurance. You pay me a premium now. If your ship sinks, I pay you the full value. If it arrives safely, I keep the premium. It was gambling, basically, but it was gambling on disaster. And it worked, because enough ships arrived that the premiums covered the losses. Every insurance policy you've ever had, car, home, health, comes from a Genoese merchant saying, "I'll bet you 20 gold coins that your ship doesn't sink." And they applied it to everything. Life insurance? That came later, but the idea was there. Fire insurance? After the Great Fire, definitely. But the principle, spreading risk, pooling resources, betting on safety, that's medieval. That's merchants in Italian port cities looking at the stormy Mediterranean and saying, "I can't stop the storm, but I can make sure it doesn't ruin me." Even the stock market comes from this. In Bruges, merchants would gather in front of a specific house, the house of the Van der Beurze family. They'd trade commodities, bills of exchange, insurance contracts. They'd make deals in the open air, shouting and negotiating. That gathering, that place, became the bourse. It's where we get bourse for stock exchange. Every stock market, every trading floor, is just a really big, really formalized version of medieval merchants, standing in a square in Bruges, trying to make a deal before it rained. And the information they needed to make those deals, that came from newsletters, handwritten reports of ship arrivals, commodity prices, political news. Merchants paid for them. They shared them. They based their decisions on them. The first newspapers were just these newsletters, printed later, sold to the public. Every headline you've ever read, every stock ticker you've ever watched, comes from a medieval merchant needing to know if the Venetian fleet made it home safely. Now, let's go back to the peasants one last time. 'Cause they weren't just farming. They were building. Their houses were wattle and daub, sticks and mud. It was cheap. It was fast. It was temporary. But some of those houses lasted centuries. The ones that lasted were the ones where they improved the technique. They used better sticks. They mixed the mud with straw for strength. They whitewashed it to keep out the rain. They added stone foundations. They made the temporary permanent. Every house you've ever lived in, every building you've ever entered, is just a really fancy, really permanent version of a peasant's mud hut. And the villages themselves? They grew up around common land. The green, the pasture, the woods. Everyone had rights to use it. To graze animals, to gather firewood, to collect acorns for pigs. That was the emergency. If you didn't have land, you could still survive if you had common rights. And when the rich tried to take that land away, when they enclosed it, the poor fought back. They rioted. They pulled down fences. They insisted on their ancient rights. Every public park, every national forest, every right to roam law comes from peasants saying, "This land belongs to all of us, not just you." Even the roads we walk on come from this. The rights of way, the footpaths across fields, the lanes between villages. Those were established by people walking the same route every day for centuries. They became legal rights. You couldn't block them. You couldn't plow them up. They were public forever. Every hike you've ever taken on a public footpath, you're walking a route that a medieval peasant walked to get to market or to church or to the next village to see their mother. And think about the inns. Travel was dangerous. You needed a place to sleep, to eat, to stable your horse. Inns grew up along the main routes. They were rough, crowded, full of strangers. But they were safe, or safe enough. They had rules. The innkeeper was responsible for your goods. If something was stolen, he paid. That was the law. Every hotel you've ever stayed in, every Airbnb, is just a really clean, really expensive version of a medieval inn where you slept in a room full of strangers and hoped your horse was still there in the morning. Now let's talk about something you don't think about. The chimney. Before the 12th century, most houses had a fire in the middle of the room and a hole in the roof. The smoke filled the room, then drifted out. It was smoky, it was dark, it was inefficient. But it worked. Then someone figured out how to put the fire against the wall and run the smoke up a flue. A chimney. It was an emergency fix for smoky rooms, and it changed everything. You could have a second floor now because the smoke didn't have to go through it. You could have separate rooms because you could heat them separately. The entire concept of the modern house, with rooms, with floors, with heat that doesn't kill you, comes from someone saying, "I'm tired of my eyes burning. Let's move the fire to the wall." And the windows? They were just holes with shutters at first. Let in light, let in cold. Then they used oiled paper or thin slices of horn. Translucent, not transparent. Then glass, but glass was expensive. So they made small panes, let it together. That's still how we make stained glass windows. Every window you've ever looked through, every pane of glass, is a descendant of a medieval craftsman trying to let light in without letting the cold in with it. Even the doors, they were just planks, nailed together. But they needed to be strong to keep out animals, enemies, the weather, so they used iron straps, big hinges, massive locks. They made them heavy, solid, permanent. Every door you've ever opened, every lock you've ever turned is just a fancier version of a medieval door that was designed to keep a Viking out long enough for you to grab your sword. And the furniture? Tables were just boards on trestles. You put them up for meals, took them down after. Chairs were for important people, the chairman. Everyone else sat on benches or stools. Beds were just straw on the floor or a rope frame with a mattress. But some of them got fancy. 4-poster beds with curtains to keep out the draft, carved chests to store clothes, cupboards to hold food. Every piece of furniture in your house is just a medieval peasant's emergency solution to not having a place to sit or sleep or store stuff, made fancy by centuries of improvement. And the textiles, clothes were expensive. You didn't throw them away. You patched them. You passed them down. You cut them up and made something else. Rags became paper. Old clothes became quilts. Every piece of fabric was used until it fell apart and then used again. The entire recycling movement, the idea that we shouldn't waste things, that we should mend and reuse and repurpose, that's not new. That's medieval. That's what you did when cloth cost more than food, and you couldn't just go to the store and buy a new shirt. Even the way we clean comes from this. Soap was made from fat and ash. Lye was made from wood ash and water. You boiled clothes in a pot. You beat them with a paddle. You rinsed them in the river. It was hard work, but it worked. And when the river was frozen, you had to find another way. You invented the laundry room, the washboard, the mangle. Every washing machine, every dryer, every detergent is just a medieval woman trying to get the mud out of her husband's tunic without freezing her hands off. And now let's go back to the cities, because cities were emergencies in themselves. Too many people, too little space, too much waste. They solved it the only way they could. They threw it in the street. Then they complained about the smell. Then they made rules. Don't throw your waste out the window after dark. Don't throw it at all. Take it to the river. Don't throw it in the river. That's where we drink from. Every sanitation law, every public health regulation, every garbage collection schedule comes from medieval cities trying not to drown in their own filth. And the plague taught them something else. Clean water matters. They didn't know why, but they knew that if the water smelled bad, people got sick. So they built conduits. They brought fresh water from outside the city. They made fountains where everyone could get it. They protected the sources. Every water treatment plant, every tap you turn on, is a descendant of a medieval city official saying, "We can't keep drinking from the same river we dump our sewage in." That's just stupid. Even the sewers. They were just open ditches at first, running down the middle of the street. And then they covered them. Then they built underground channels. Then they connected them to houses. It took centuries, but it happened. Every toilet you've ever flushed, every drain you've ever used, goes back to a medieval city that realized living in your own waste was killing you and decided to do something about it. And the streets themselves, they were mud. Deep, stinking, treacherous mud. So they paved them. First with cobbles, then with stone slabs. They raised them. They put gutters on the sides. They made them wide enough for carts. Every street you've ever walked on, every road you've ever driven, is just a medieval mud path that got paved because people were tired of losing their shoes in the muck. Even the bridges. We talked about the temporary bridge in Florence, but think about London Bridge. It was the only bridge across the Thames for centuries. It had houses on it, shops on it, a chapel on it. It was a community, a marketplace, a fortification. It was built because you couldn't cross the river any other way. And when it burned or fell down, they built it again. Every bridge you've ever crossed is just a medieval emergency crossing made permanent, made stronger, made safer. And the tunnels? They didn't have many, but they had mines. Coal mines, tin mines, salt mines. They dug deep, dangerous holes in the ground. They shored them up with timber. They drained them with pumps. They ventilated them with shafts. Every tunnel you've ever driven through, every subway you've ever ridden, is just a really big, really safe version of a medieval mine where people died all the time so you could have coal for your fire. Now let's talk about something completely different. The university gown. Academics wear them at graduation. They look ridiculous, but they're medieval. In the 1200s, scholars were clerics. They wore the same clothes as priests, long robes, hoods. It kept them warm in unheated buildings. And when they got their degree, they got a special hood, a special gown, to show they were masters. We still do it. Every graduation ceremony, every ridiculous outfit is just a medieval scholar trying to stay warm while he argued about Aristotle. And the mortarboard, the hat, that came later, but the idea is the same. It's a symbol. It says, I'm a scholar. It's a uniform. And uniforms come from the Middle Ages, too. Servants wore livery. Soldiers wore tabards. Monks wore habits. You knew who someone was by what they wore. Every uniform you've ever seen, police, military, fast food, comes from medieval people needing to know at a glance who they were dealing with. Even the handshake. It's medieval. Knights did it to show they weren't holding a weapon. Merchants did it to seal a deal. It was a sign of trust, of peace, of agreement. Every handshake you've ever given is a medieval gesture that says, I come in peace. Let's do business. And the toast? You clink glasses so the drink sloshes into the other glass. It shows you trust each other. You're willing to share the same drink, to risk the same poison. It's medieval paranoia made into ritual. Every time you raise a glass and say cheers, you're saying, I trust you not to have poisoned this. Even the way we eat comes from this. Forks were weird in the Middle Ages. People used knives and spoons, and they ate with their hands. Forks were seen as fancy, foreign, effeminate. But they caught on because they were useful. They kept your hands clean. They let you eat hot food without burning yourself. Every fork you've ever used is a medieval Italian's attempt to look sophisticated while eating pasta. And the plates? They were trenchers, slices of stale bread. You put your food on the bread, ate the food, then ate the bread, or gave it to the poor. It was a plate you could eat. Every plate you've ever used is just a really durable version of a piece of bread that soaked up your dinner. Even the napkin. You wiped your hands on the tablecloth, on your clothes, on the dog. But if you were fancy, you had a napkin. A cloth just for wiping. Every napkin you've ever used is a medieval status symbol that became a necessity. Now let's go back to the law one more time, because the law is full of medieval emergencies. Trial by jury? That was a way to get local knowledge. You didn't have police, you didn't have investigators. So you asked the neighbors, what do you know about this case? They told you, and then they decided. Every jury you've ever served on is just a group of medieval villagers being asked what they know about the crime. And innocent until proven guilty? That's not really medieval. They had ordeals. But the idea that you need evidence, that you need witnesses, that you need a fair hearing, that comes from medieval courts trying to be better than trial by combat. Every right you have in a courtroom comes from a medieval judge saying, let's not kill each other over this, let's talk about it instead. Even the concept of the king's peace. The king said, in certain places at certain times you can't fight. You have to be peaceful. Markets, fairs, roads, these were protected. Break the peace there. And you're not just hurting someone, you're hurting the king. Every law against violence in public places comes from a medieval king trying to keep trade routes open so he could tax them. And think about sanctuary. Churches were safe places. If you committed a crime, you could run to a church and stay there. The king's men couldn't get you. You could then confess or agree to leave the country, or just stay there forever. It was a loophole, a way to avoid the harshness of the law. Every asylum law, every protection for refugees, comes from medieval churches saying, no bloodshed here, this is God's house. Even the concept of benefit of clergy. If you could read, you could claim to be a cleric and be tried in church courts instead of royal courts. Church courts were softer, no death penalty. So people learned to read just to claim the benefit. It was an emergency escape from execution. Every time someone uses a legal technicality to avoid a harsh sentence, they're doing what a medieval criminal did when he memorized a psalm to prove he could read. Now let's talk about the end of the Middle Ages, because it didn't end neatly. It blurred into the Renaissance, into the Reformation, into the modern world. And all those medieval fixes, the quarantines, the contracts, the clocks, the chimneys, they just kept going. They became normal. They became the way we do things. We forgot they were ever emergencies. We forget that someone somewhere was the first person to say, let's hold a ship for 40 days. Someone was the first to say, let's write this down so we don't forget. Someone was the first to say, let's put the fire against the wall. They were scared, they were desperate, they were guessing, and they got it right. Not perfectly right, but right enough. Right enough to keep going. Right enough to pass it on. And that's the story. It's not about kings and queens and battles. It's about ordinary people facing ordinary disasters and fixing them in ways that lasted. It's about a Venetian official staring at a ship full of plague and making a decision that would save millions of lives centuries later. It's about a Dutch farmer patching a dike and inventing local government. It's about a monk bored with chanting and inventing harmony. They didn't know they were making the future. They were just trying to get through the day. But the future is made of days, and the things they did, the things they improvised, the things they threw together in a panic, those became the walls we live inside, the rules we follow, the tools we use, the songs we sing. So next time you wash your hands, or check the time, or sign a contract, or raise a glass, think about them. The scared, tired, clever people who had no idea what they were doing, but did it anyway, and got it right, and made us who we are. You know what's funny? We talk about the Middle Ages like it's this closed book, like it ended in 1492 or 1517, or whenever you want to draw the line. But it never really ended. Those emergency fixes, they're still propping us up. We just don't see them anymore because they've become the background noise of civilization. Take the post office again. We talked about merchants carrying letters, but let's dig deeper. In the 1200s, the University of Bologna needed to communicate with its students scattered across Europe, so they created a system. They had messengers, couriers, regular routes. They were the first to have something like a postal service. Not for kings, not for merchants, for students, for kids away from home who needed money from dad. Every time you get a letter, every package that shows up at your door, you're benefiting from a bunch of medieval students saying, I need my mom to send me more socks. And the socks themselves, they were linen or wool. They were held up with garters, and when they got holes, you darned them. You wove thread back and forth across the hole until it was closed. That's darning. Every time you sew a button back on, every time you patch a pair of jeans, you're doing what a medieval peasant did, because buying new clothes wasn't an option. The entire concept of mending, of repair instead of replace, comes from a time when cloth was so valuable that you wore it until it literally fell apart. And then you made something else from the pieces. Now think about buttons. They existed before the Middle Ages, but they weren't common. Then clothes got tighter. You needed something to close them. So you used buttons and buttonholes. It was an emergency fix for my tunic keeps falling open. Every button you've ever done up is a medieval tailor solving a wardrobe malfunction. And zippers? Okay, those are modern. But the idea of fastening, of closing something securely, that's medieval. They had hooks and eyes, they had laces, they had buckles. Every buckle on every shoe, every strap on every bag goes back to a medieval craftsman who needed to keep something closed and figured out how. Let's talk about shoes. They were just leather, cut to shape, sewn together. Sometimes they had wooden soles, clogs. Sometimes they were just wrapped leather, moccasins, basically. They wore out fast. So you patched them, you resold them, you passed them down. Every cobbler, every shoe repair shop is just a medieval shoemaker trying to keep people's feet dry because new shoes were too expensive. And the wooden form they shaped shoes on, that's medieval too. Every shoe you've ever worn was shaped on a last that hasn't changed fundamentally since the 1300s. Same with hats, same with gloves, same with everything we wear. The basic shapes, the basic techniques, the basic tools, they're medieval. We've just made them faster, cheaper, more consistent. But the underlying idea, that's 700 years old. Now think about bread. The staff of life, right? But bread needed ovens, and ovens were expensive. So in medieval villages, there was often just one oven, the Lord's oven. And you had to pay to use it. That was the law. You couldn't bake at home. It was a monopoly, a tax, a way to control people. Every time you bake bread in your own oven, you're benefiting from centuries of peasants fighting for the right to bake without paying the Lord. And the bread itself? It was dark. It was coarse. It had stuff in it. Bits of stone from the mill, bits of straw from the threshing. It was survival food. White bread was for the rich. It was finer, softer, more expensive. Every artisan loaf you buy today, every sourdough you slave over, is just a medieval rich person's bread made available to everyone. But here's the thing. Bread was also currency. You paid workers in bread. You gave alms in bread. You judged hospitality by the bread you offered. Breaking bread meant sharing a meal, sharing trust, sharing life. Every time you sit down to dinner with someone, you're doing what medieval people did when they broke bread together and said, "We're friends now, we're not enemies." And the table itself? We talked about trestles. But think about the tablecloth. It wasn't just for decoration. It was a napkin, a towel, a wipe. You cleaned your hands on it. You wiped your knife on it. You used it to cover food, to keep flies off. Every tablecloth you've ever used is a medieval multi-tool disguised as linen. Now let's go back to the church, because the church was everywhere. It was the government, the school, the hospital, the bank, the theater, the art gallery. It did everything because nothing else did. And when something went wrong, the church fixed it, or tried to. Take the poor. There were always poor people. And the church said, take care of them, feed them, clothe them, shelter them. It was a religious duty. So monasteries gave out food, churches gave out alms, hospitals took in the sick and the old and the orphan. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it was something. Every charity, every social safety net, every welfare program comes from the church saying, you have to help the poor or you're going to hell. And the sick? We talked about hospitals. But think about lepers. Leprosy was everywhere in the Middle Ages. And it was terrifying. It disfigured you. It isolated you. It killed you slowly. So they built leper hospitals, leprosaria, outside the city walls. They gave lepers their own churches, their own cemeteries, their own communities. It was segregation, sure. But it was also care. It was a way to say, you're still human, even if we can't touch you. Every hospice, every palliative care center, every place we send the dying to die with dignity is a descendant of a medieval leper hospital. And the mad? They were lunatics, touched by the moon. Some were kept at home, some wandered, some were locked up, but some were cared for in monasteries, in shrines, in holy places. They were seen as closer to God sometimes. Every mental health facility, every psychiatric ward is a medieval attempt to understand why some people's minds don't work like everyone else's. Now think about education. We talked about universities. But what about regular kids? Most didn't go to school. They learned at home, farming, cooking, sewing, fighting. But some went to song schools where they learned to sing for church. Some went to grammar schools where they learned Latin. Some were taught by priests, by monks, by wandering scholars. Every public school, every classroom, every teacher is a medieval attempt to pass on what we know to the next generation. Because if we don't, they'll lose it. And the books they used? Horn books. A piece of wood with a handle covered in horn with the alphabet on it. That was the textbook. You learned your letters from that. Every iPad, every tablet, every learning device is just a really fancy horn book. Now let's talk about something completely different, the forest. The forest was scary. It was dark. It was full of animals. It was full of outlaws. But it was also necessary. It gave you wood for fuel, for building, for tools. It gave you game for meat. It gave you nuts and berries and mushrooms. It gave you medicine, herbs and roots and bark. Every national park, every nature preserve, every forest you've ever walked in is a medieval wood that people protected because they needed it to survive. And the animals? You hunted them, you ate them, you wore them. You used their bones for tools, their sinew for thread, their fat for soap. Nothing was wasted. Every time you buy leather shoes, every time you eat a burger, you're using animals the same way medieval people did. For food, for clothing, for tools. We've just forgotten that the animal had to die first. Now think about the sea. It was food, fish, shellfish, seaweed. It was trade, ships carrying goods. It was danger, storms, pirates, shipwrecks. And it was mystery. What was out there beyond the horizon? Every time you eat fish and chips, every time you take a ferry, every time you look out at the ocean and wonder, you're doing what medieval people did. You're using the sea because you have to, and fearing it because you should. And the boats? We talked about cogs. But think about fishing boats. Small, open, dangerous. You went out in the morning, you came back in the evening, if you came back at all. Every fishing trawler, every commercial fishing boat is just a medieval fishing boat made bigger and safer. But the risk? Still there. The sea doesn't care how modern you are. Now let's go back to the land. Because the land was everything. It was wealth, it was status, it was survival. If you owned land, you were somebody. If you didn't, you worked for somebody who did. And the way you worked it, the plowing, the sowing, the harvesting, that was medieval. The heavy plow with a mold board that turned the soil over, that was medieval. It let you farm the heavy clay soils of Northern Europe. It opened up whole new lands for farming. Every field you've ever seen, every farm you've ever passed, is using techniques that medieval peasants invented because their old plows didn't work in the mud. And the horses? They replaced oxen because they were faster. But they needed different harnesses. The horse collar, medieval. It let horses pull without choking. Every horse-drawn carriage, every plow horse, every Amish farmer uses a collar that was invented in the Middle Ages because someone realized that choking your horse to death was bad for productivity. And the horseshoes? They protected hooves on hard roads. They were nailed on by blacksmiths. Every farrier, every horseshoe you've ever seen on a wall for good luck is medieval. The Romans didn't have them, or not like that. They were a medieval fix for my horse's feet are wearing out. Now think about the blacksmith himself. He was the mechanic of the Middle Ages. He fixed everything. Tools, weapons, pots, gates. He made everything. Nails, hinges, horseshoes, swords. He was essential. Every garage, every auto repair shop, every mechanic is a blacksmith shop with different tools. You bring him your broken thing, he fixes it, you pay him, you go away happy. And the nails? They were handmade. Each one was hammered out by a blacksmith. They were expensive, so you reused them. You pulled them out of old wood and straightened them and used them again. Every nail you've ever bought at the hardware store is a cheap, mass-produced version of something that used to be so valuable you'd save it from a burned-down house. Now let's talk about the mill, the water mill, the windmill. They ground grain, they sawed wood, they fulled cloth. They were the first machines, really. Gears, shafts, belts, all medieval. Every factory, every power plant, every machine that uses moving parts to do work is a descendant of a medieval mill. The water turns, the wheel turns, the gears turn, the stone turns, the grain becomes flour. That's it. That's the Industrial Revolution in miniature. And it happened in the Middle Ages. And the miller, he was hated. He was a cheat, a thief, a liar. Everyone said he took more than his share. Every folk story, every joke about dishonest tradesmen starts with the miller. Because he had his hand in your flour, and you couldn't watch him all the time. Every time you distrust a tradesman, every time you check your change, you're being a medieval peasant suspicious of the miller. Now think about the baker. He took your flour and made bread, or he sold you bread he made from his flour, and he cheated too, putting sawdust in the flour, making loaves smaller than they should be. Every time you check the weight of a loaf, every time you complain about shrinkflation, you're doing what medieval customers did when they realized their bread was smaller than yesterday. And the butcher, he sold you meat. But was it fresh? Was it the right animal? Did he cut it fairly? Every butcher shop, every meat counter, every inspection stamp comes from medieval customers demanding to know that they weren't being sold rotten meat or cat meat or worse. Now let's talk about the market. And we mentioned it before, but let's really dig in. The market was the center of life. You went there to buy, to sell, to see people, to hear news, to find a job, to find a lover. It was noisy, smelly, crowded, dangerous, wonderful. Every mall, every shopping center, every farmer's market is just a medieval market with better parking. And the stalls, they were temporary. You put them up in the morning, you took them down at night, you paid rent for the space, you had a license to trade. Every vendor, every food truck, every pop-up shop is a medieval stall holder who just wants to sell you something without the Lord taking too much of a cut. And the money changers, they sat at tables, bancos. When they failed, their banco was broken. Banco rupto. Bankrupt. Every bank, every ATM, every credit card comes from a money changer sitting at a table in a medieval market, changing your florins into ducats so you could buy something from a foreign merchant. Now think about the fair, the big market, once a year. People came from all over. They brought their best goods. They sold, they bought, they partied. They watched entertainers, jugglers, acrobats, musicians. They ate strange food. They met strange people. Every carnival, every state fair, every festival is a medieval fair where the rules were looser and the fun was wilder. And the entertainers, they were travelers. They went from fair to fair, town to town. They were outsiders always, but they brought joy. They brought stories. They brought music. Every musician you've ever seen on stage, every actor, every comedian is a medieval entertainer who wandered from place to place, hoping to make a living by making people laugh. Now let's go back to the castle. Because the castle wasn't just a fortress. It was a home, an office, a barracks, a prison, a symbol. It said, I'm in charge here. And when you attacked it, you used siege engines, trebuchets, battering rams, siege towers. Every piece of military hardware, every tank, every missile is a descendant of a medieval siege engine designed to break down walls and kill the people inside. And the defenders, they used arrows, boiling oil, hot sand. They dropped things on your head. They shot you with crossbows. Every soldier in a defensive position, every sniper in a window is a medieval archer on a castle wall, trying to hit you before you hit him. And when the castle fell, you were killed, or ransomed, or enslaved. That was the rule. Every prisoner of war, every hostage situation, every ransom demand goes back to medieval warfare, where you captured people and sold them back to their families. Now think about the knight. He was a warrior on horseback. He had armor, a sword, a lance. He had a code, chivalry. He was supposed to protect the weak, defend the church, serve his lord. He often didn't. But the idea was there. Every soldier, every officer, every person in uniform who swears to protect and serve is a descendant of a knight who promised to be brave and good, and mostly failed, but sometimes succeeded. And the sword, it was expensive. It was personal. It had a name sometimes. It was passed down. Every heirloom, every family treasure, everything you keep because your grandfather had it, is a sword. Not literally, but in meaning. It's the thing that connects you to the past, that reminds you who you are and where you came from. Now let's talk about the horse. It was transport, it was power, it was status. If you had a horse, you were somebody. If you didn't, you walked. Every car, every motorcycle, every vehicle is a horse. You feed it fuel, you take care of it, you ride it where you need to go, and when it breaks, you fix it, just like a horse. And the saddle, it made riding bearable. It kept you on the horse. It held your stuff. Every car seat, every bicycle seat, every chair you sit in is a saddle. It's the thing that supports you while you move. And the stirrup, it let you stand up in the saddle. It let you fight from horseback. It changed everything. Every footrest, every step, every thing that lets you put your foot somewhere while you're sitting is a stirrup. It's a small thing that made a huge difference. Now think about the cart. It carried stuff. It had wheels, an axle, a bed. You pulled it with horses or oxen. Every truck, every trailer, every wagon is a cart. The wheels are better, the suspension is better, but the idea is the same. Put stuff on it, pull it somewhere, take it off. And the wheel itself, it was wood with iron tires. It had spokes, a hub, a rim. It was made by wheelwrights. Every wheel on every car, every bicycle, every piece of machinery is a medieval wheel made better. But the round thing that rolls, that's ancient. The Middle Ages just made it work better. Now let's talk about the road again. We mentioned it, but think about the surface. It was dirt, mud, stones. It was rutted, uneven, dangerous. You traveled slowly if you traveled at all. Every paved road, every highway, every street is a medieval road made smooth. But the path, the route, the direction, that's medieval. That's where people walked, so that's where the road went. And the bridge? We talked about it. But think about the tolls. You paid to cross. Someone sat at the end and collected your penny. Every toll road, every bridge toll, every congestion charge is a medieval toll collector saying, pay up or swim. Now think about the inn again. We covered it, but let's go deeper. The inn had a sign, a picture, because most people couldn't read. The red lion, the king's head, the bell. Every pub sign, every restaurant logo, every brand is a medieval inn sign that told you where to get a drink and a bed. And the beer, it was safe to drink when water wasn't. It was weak. It was nutritious. It was every day. Every beer you've ever drunk, every ale, every lager, is a medieval drink that kept people from dying of dysentery. And the wine, it was for the rich, for the church, for special occasions. It was imported, expensive, fancy. Every bottle of wine you've ever opened is a medieval luxury that became ordinary. Now let's talk about the kitchen. It was a separate building sometimes because fire. It had a hearth, a pot, a spit. You cooked over an open flame. Every kitchen, every stove, every oven, is a medieval hearth with better ventilation. You still put food over heat until it's done. That hasn't changed. And the pot? It was iron, heavy, black. It hung over the fire. You put stuff in it. You stirred it. You ate it. Every pot you've ever used is a medieval pot, made lighter. But the idea, a container for cooking, that's as old as cooking itself. And the spoon? It was wood, mostly. You carved it yourself. Every spoon you've ever used is a medieval spoon made of metal or plastic. But it's still a little bowl on a stick for getting food to your mouth. Now think about the plate again. We said trenchers. But think about the table manners. You didn't burp. You didn't pick your nose. You didn't reach across. There were rules. Every etiquette guide, every elbows off the table, every wait until everyone is served, comes from medieval courts where how you ate showed who you were. And the feast? It was a show. Course after course, weird foods, entertainments. It was power displayed on a table. Every wedding reception, every holiday dinner, every buffet is a medieval feast where you showed off how rich you were by how much food you wasted. Now let's go back to the plague one more time, because it keeps coming back, and every time it came, they tried something new. They burned clothes, they fumigated houses, they isolated the sick, they buried the dead quickly, they ran away, they prayed. They did everything they could think of, and some of it worked. Some of it didn't. But they kept trying. Every public health measure, every epidemic response, every time we wash our hands or wear a mask, we're doing what medieval people did when they didn't know what else to do. We're trying something. And when the plague finally faded, it left changes. Wages went up because there were fewer workers. Peasants had more power because lords needed them. The old order cracked. Every labor movement, every worker's right, every minimum wage comes from peasants after the plague saying, I won't work for that. Pay me more or I'll go somewhere else. Now think about the rebellions, the Peasants' Revolt in England, the Jacquerie in France, the Ciompi in Florence. They rose up, they demanded things, they were crushed, but they tried. Every protest, every strike, every march on Washington is a medieval rebellion where ordinary people said, we've had enough. And the ideas they demanded? Fair wages, fair rents, fair laws. The same things we demand today, because those things never really changed. Power still wants to take from the powerless, and the powerless still want to keep what's theirs. Now let's talk about the guilds. We mentioned them. But think about what they did. They set standards. They trained apprentices. They looked after their members. They controlled who could work. Every union, every professional association, every licensing board is a medieval guild saying, you can't call yourself a carpenter unless you know how to hammer a nail. And the masterpiece? You had to make one to become a master. It showed you knew your trade. Every final exam, every thesis, every portfolio review is a masterpiece. It's the thing you make to prove you're ready. Now think about the craftsmen themselves, the masons who built cathedrals, the carpenters who built houses, the weavers who made cloth, the tanners who made leather. They were skilled, they were proud, they were essential. Every tradesperson, every skilled worker, every person who makes things with their hands is a medieval craftsman who learned their trade from someone who learned it, from someone who learned it, from someone back 700 years. And the tools they use? Hammers, saws, chisels, planes, needles, looms. We've improved them, but they're still the same basic things. You still hit a nail with a hammer. You still cut wood with a saw. You still sew cloth with a needle. The tools change, but the actions don't. Now let's talk about the cathedral. It was the biggest thing most people ever saw. It took generations to build. It was full of art, full of meaning, full of God. It was a Bible in stone for people who couldn't read. Every great building, every skyscraper, every monument is a cathedral. It's the thing we build to show what we believe in. And the stained glass, it told stories, it let in light, it was beautiful. Every window you've ever admired, every piece of art, everything that's beautiful for no reason, except that beauty matters, is stained glass. It's the thing that makes the ordinary extraordinary. Now think about the music again. We talked about polyphony, but think about the instruments. The lute, the viol, the harp, the bagpipes. They made music. They entertained, they praised God. Every guitar, every violin, every keyboard is a medieval instrument made better. But the strings, the wood, the sound, that's medieval. And the dances? They danced in circles, in lines, in couples. They stamped, they twirled, they clapped. Every dance you've ever done, every wedding, every party, every club, is a medieval dance where people moved to music because it felt good. Now let's go back to the calendar. We talked about Easter. But think about the saints' days. Every day had a saint. Some were major, some were minor. They marked the year. They told you when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest. Every holiday, every long weekend, every bank holiday is a saint's day with the saint taken out. And the fairs, they were on saints' days often. You celebrated the saint by trading, by feasting, by having fun. Every festival, every celebration is a saint's day where we forgot the saint but kept the party. Now think about the seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. They mattered. They controlled everything. When you could travel, when you could farm, when you could fight. Every season, every weather forecast, every time you check the temperature, you're responding to the same cycles that medieval people responded to. The sun still rises and sets. The crops still grow and die. We're not as separate from nature as we think. And the stars, they guided you at night. They told you when to plant. They told stories. Every time you look up at the night sky, you're seeing what medieval people saw. The same constellations, the same planets, the same mystery. Now let's talk about death. It was everywhere. You died young, often. You died of disease, of accident, of violence. You died in childbirth, in battle, in bed. And they prepared for it. They prayed. They confessed. They made wills. They bought indulgences. They did everything they could to ensure a good death. Every hospice, every funeral, every grave is a medieval death with better medicine. But the fear, the grief, the hope, that's still the same. And the afterlife? They believed in it. Heaven, hell, purgatory. It shaped everything they did. Every moral choice, every good deed, every sin was weighed against eternity. Every time you do something because it's right, not because it's easy, you're channeling a medieval person who believed their soul depended on it. Now think about the saints. They were helpers. You prayed to them for specific things. Saint Anthony for lost things. Saint Christopher for travel. Saint Jude for hopeless cases. Every time you ask for help, every time you hope for a miracle, every time you say a little prayer to the universe, you're asking a saint. You just don't call them that anymore. And the relics? Bits of saints. Bones, hair, clothes. They were powerful. They healed you. They protected you. They brought you closer to God. Every souvenir, every keepsake, everything you keep because it reminds you of someone you loved is a relic. It's the physical connection to something beyond yourself. Now let's go back to the law one final time. Because the law is where medieval thinking is most stuck. We still use terms from French, from Latin. We still have courts, judges, juries. We still have appeals, evidence, precedent. Every time you go to court, you're entering a medieval world where the forms matter as much as the facts. And the punishments? They were brutal. Hanging, burning, beheading, stocks, pillory, ducking stool. They were public. They were meant to deter. Every prison, every punishment. Every time we lock someone up, we're doing what medieval people did. Removing the dangerous, punishing the guilty. We just do it differently now. But they also had mercy. They had sanctuary. They had benefit of clergy. They had pardons. They had ways out. Every plea bargain, every parole, every second chance is a medieval mercy that said, maybe you don't have down to die for this. Now think about the end of the Middle Ages. It didn't end with a bang. It blurred. The Renaissance happened while medieval people were still being medieval. The Reformation happened while Catholics were still being Catholic. The New World was discovered while old worlds were still old. There was no moment when everyone said, okay, it's over, we're modern now, because we're still medieval. We still live in houses with chimneys. We still eat off plates. We still wear buttons. We still sing harmonies. We still sign contracts. We still quarantine the sick. We still elect representatives. We still go to school. We still fall in love. We still have children. We still die. The Middle Ages didn't build our world. They stumbled into it. They fixed one emergency after another, and those fixes became the walls we live inside. We don't see them because they're everywhere. But they're there. In the water you drink, in the money you spend, in the music you hear, in the laws you obey. So next time you wash your hands, think of Venice. Next time you sign a contract, think of Genoa. Next time you sing in the shower, think of a bored monk in Paris. Next time you look at a clock, think of a monastery trying to pray on time. Next time you eat bread, think of a peasant who grew the grain, ground it at the mill, and baked it in the Lord's oven. They were us. They were scared, tired, clever, desperate, hopeful. They did what they could with what they had, and what they did became what we do, forever. You know what the most medieval thing about us is? It's not the buildings or the laws or the money. It's the way we think. The categories we use, the assumptions we make, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we're here. All of that was shaped in the Middle Ages by people who had no idea they were shaping the future. They were just trying to make sense of a world that didn't make sense. Take time again. We talked about clocks, but think about the week. 7 days. 6 days work, 1 day rest. That's medieval. That's the church saying, you have to stop on Sunday, it's God's day. Every weekend, every day off, every time you sleep in on a Saturday and feel slightly guilty about it, you're living by a medieval rule that said rest is holy. And the hours? We still divide the day into 24 hours, even though the length of an hour used to change with the seasons. We still have noon, the 9th hour after sunrise. We still have midnight, the middle of the night. Every time you say it's 3 o'clock, you're using a system that monks invented so they'd know when to pray. Now think about the year. January to December. That's Roman, mostly. But the way we mark it, New Year, Easter, Christmas, that's medieval. The church took pagan festivals and Christianized them. Winter solstice became Christmas. Spring equinox became Easter. Summer solstice became St. John's Day. Autumn harvest became Michaelmas. Every holiday you celebrate, every season you mark, is a pagan festival filtered through a medieval church. And the saints' days we mentioned, they're still there. St. Patrick's Day, St. Valentine's Day, All Saints' Day, Halloween. We've forgotten the saints, but we kept the party. Every time you dress up for Halloween, every time you give chocolates on February 14th, you're doing something medieval. Now let's talk about language, the words we use. Half of English is French or Latin, and it got there because of the Norman conquest in 1066. That was an emergency. A bunch of French guys showed up and took over, and suddenly the king spoke French and the peasants spoke English. The two languages mixed, and we ended up with this weird hybrid where we have different words for the same thing. Pig and pork, cow and beef, sheep and mutton. The animal has an English name because the peasants raised it. The meat has a French name because the Normans ate it. Every time you order a hamburger, you're speaking a language shaped by a medieval conquest. And the grammar, the way we put sentences together, that's Germanic mostly. But the vocabulary, half French, half Latin, with bits of everything else thrown in. English is a medieval mess, a language that got cobbled together in an emergency because nobody could agree on what to speak. And now it's the global language. The world speaks medieval. Now think about names. John, Mary, Peter, Paul. Biblical names, medieval names. Every time you meet someone named Christopher or Catherine or Nicholas, you're meeting a name that was popular in the Middle Ages because of a saint. And the surnames? Smith, Baker, Cooper, Miller, Jobs, or Hill, Ford, Wood, Lane. Places or Johnson, Davidson, Jackson. Son of. Every last name is a medieval identifier that stuck. You are, in a very real way, the descendant of a blacksmith or a baker or someone who lived by a hill. Now let's talk about the way we organize knowledge. The 7 liberal arts: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. That's what you studied in medieval universities. It was the entire curriculum. Everything you know, everything you've learned, is built on that framework. Every time you write an essay, you're using rhetoric. Every time you solve a math problem, you're using arithmetic. Every time you look at the stars, you're using astronomy. The categories haven't changed. We've just added more stuff on top. And the way we argue? Logic. Syllogisms. If this, then that. That's medieval. That's Aristotle filtered through Aquinas. Every debate, every courtroom argument, every political speech uses logical structures that were codified in the Middle Ages. We think we're being rational, but we're just following rules that monks made up so they could argue about God without killing each other. Now think about the way we organize society. 3 estates: those who pray, those who fight, those who work. Clergy, nobility, everyone else. That was the theory. It never really worked that way. But it's how they thought about the world. And we still think that way. We still have leaders, warriors, workers. We just call them politicians, soldiers, laborers. The categories are the same. The names have changed. And the way we organize space. Towns, cities, countries, borders, boundaries, territories. Most of those were drawn in the Middle Ages. The county lines in England, the regions in France, the provinces in Spain. They were administrative units created by kings and dukes so they could collect taxes and raise armies. Every time you cross a state line, every time you vote in a district, you're respecting a border that some medieval official drew because he needed to know who owed him what. Now think about the way we organize power. Kings, lords, commons. That was the medieval model. And it evolved into what we have now: presidents, parliaments, citizens. But the idea that power should be balanced, that different groups should have a say, that's medieval. Magna Carta, 1215. A bunch of barons forced the king to agree that he wasn't above the law. Every constitution, every Bill of Rights, every time a court strikes down a law, you're seeing the consequences of that emergency meeting at Runnymede. And the Parliament itself, it started as the King's Council, a group of advisors. Then they added representatives from the towns, from the counties, the model Parliament of 1295, knights, burgesses, clergy, lords, all there to advise the king, and more importantly, to agree to taxes. Every legislature and every Congress, Every council is a medieval parliament where the king asked for money and the people said, "We'll give it to you, but you have to listen to us first." Now let's talk about the way we organize religion. The Catholic Church. It was the only show in town for 1,000 years, and it shaped everything: art, music, philosophy, law, politics. Then the Reformation happened, another emergency. Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door in 1517 because he was angry about indulgences. And suddenly there were Protestants, and Catholics, and wars, and centuries of conflict. Every denomination, every church, every sect is a result of that medieval emergency that turned into a permanent split. And the way we think about faith, that's medieval too. The arguments about God, about salvation, about good and evil, they were worked out in the Middle Ages by people who took these questions seriously because they believed eternity was at stake. We may not believe the same things, but we're still asking the same questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? The questions are medieval. The answers change. Now think about the way we think about love. Courtly love. Troubadours singing about unattainable women. Knights doing deeds for their ladies. It was a game, a fantasy, a literary convention. But it changed how we think about romance. The idea that love should be passionate, that it should be about choice, that it should involve suffering and longing and devotion. That's medieval. Every love song, every romantic comedy, every time someone says, "I can't live without you," you're hearing an echo of a troubadour in a castle singing to a lady who was probably married to someone else. And marriage, it was a contract, a business arrangement, about property, about alliances, about children. Love was nice if it happened, but it wasn't the point. That's still true for a lot of people, but we pretend it's not. We pretend marriage is about love, about soulmates, about happily ever after. That's the medieval romance talking. We've taken the troubadour's fantasy and made it the default. Now think about the way we think about death. We hide it. We put it in hospitals, in funeral homes, in cemeteries behind walls. Medieval people put it in the middle of town. They had charnel houses full of bones. They had churches with graves in the floor. They had death everywhere, all the time. They thought about it, talked about it, prepared for it. We try not to, but it's still there, waiting. And when it comes, we fall back on medieval rituals, prayers, funerals, graves. We pretend we're modern, but when someone dies, we're as medieval as they were. And the afterlife? Most people don't believe in hell anymore, or heaven, or purgatory. But we still act as if there's something. We still hope. We still talk about people looking down on us, or being in a better place. We still want to believe that death isn't the end. That's medieval. That's centuries of faith, baked into us so deep we can't get it out, even when we try. Now let's talk about the way we think about nature. Medieval people saw the natural world as God's creation, full of meaning, full of lessons. Every animal had a symbolic meaning. The lion was Christ. The pelican was charity. The unicorn was purity. We don't see that anymore. We see resources, ecosystems, problems to solve. But we still feel something when we see a sunset, when we hear birdsong, when we stand on a mountain. That awe, that sense of something bigger, that's medieval. That's what they felt in the cathedral of the world. And the way we think about animals, we eat them, we wear them, we use them. But we also love them. We keep them in our houses, give them names, treat them like family. That's medieval too. They had pets. They had working animals they loved. They had stories about animals that talked, that taught lessons, that showed us how to be human. Every time you talk to your dog, every time you cry when a pet dies, you're doing what medieval people did. Now think about the way we think about children. They were small adults. They worked, they learned, they obeyed. They died a lot. We treat children differently now. We protect them, educate them, cherish them. But we still expect them to grow up, to become adults, to carry on. That's medieval. That's the same hope every parent had, that their children would live, would thrive, would remember them when they were gone. And the way we think about education, we send kids to school for years. We teach them reading, writing, arithmetic. That's medieval. That's the trivium and quadrivium, updated. We teach them history, science, literature. We want them to know things, to understand things, to be able to think. That's what medieval universities wanted too. They just had fewer books. Now let's talk about the way we think about work. Most people worked on the land. They farmed. They did the same thing every day, season after season, year after year. Now we work in offices and factories and stores. But it's still work. It's still how we survive. It's still what we do most of our waking hours. And we still complain about it. Every time you groan on Monday morning, every time you can't wait for Friday, you're channeling a medieval peasant who wished he didn't have to plow that field again. And the way we think about money, we need it. We want it. We worry about it. We spend our lives chasing it. That's medieval. They had the same problems. Too little money, too many bills, too much debt. They worried about taxes, about prices, about making ends meet. Every time you check your bank balance, every time you worry about paying the rent, you're doing what medieval people did. Now think about the way we think about health. We go to doctors. We take medicine. We worry about germs, about diseases, about dying. That's medieval. They did the same thing, just with less effective tools. They went to barber surgeons, to apothecaries, to wise women. They took herbs, they got bled, they prayed. We think we're so advanced, but we still get sick. We still die. The germ theory is better than miasma theory, but the experience of illness, the fear, the pain, the hope, that hasn't changed. And the way we think about aging, we fear it, we fight it. We pretend it's not happening. Medieval people saw it differently. Old age was respected sometimes. It was wisdom, experience, survival. But it was also decline, loss, death. They didn't pretend. They knew what was coming. We pretend we don't. Now let's talk about the way we think about community. Medieval people lived in small groups. They knew everyone. They depended on each other. They helped each other. They also gossiped about each other, fought with each other, resented each other. It was complicated. We live in bigger groups now, more anonymous, more isolated. But we still need community. We still want to belong. Every club, every team, every online group is a medieval village where we know people, and they know us. And the way we think about strangers, we're suspicious. We're cautious. We're curious. And that's medieval, too. Strangers could be traders, travelers, pilgrims. They could also be thieves, spies, enemies. You didn't know, so you watched them. You tested them. You decided whether to trust them. Every time you meet someone new, every time you decide whether to let them in, you're doing what medieval people did at the city gate. Now think about the way we think about the future. We plan, we save, we worry, we hope. Medieval people did too. They planned for next year's harvest, for their children's marriages, for their own deaths. They saved grain, money, goods. They worried about war, plague, famine. They hoped for peace, for plenty, for salvation. The future was uncertain then. It's uncertain now. We just have more things to worry about. And the way we think about the past, we romanticize it. We think it was better, simpler, purer, or we think it was worse, darker, more brutal. Both are wrong. The past was just different. Medieval people thought about the past too, about Rome, about the Bible, about their ancestors. They learned from it, or thought they did, just like us. Now let's talk about the way we think about ourselves. Identity. Who are we? Medieval people knew. They were Christians. They were English, French, German. They were peasants, knights, priests. They were sons and daughters, husbands and wives, fathers and mothers. Their identity was given to them. They didn't choose it. We choose ours now, or we try to. But we're still shaped by the same things: family, place, work, faith. We just have more options. And the way we think about freedom, we value it. We fight for it. We think it's the most important thing. Medieval people had a different idea. They valued order, stability, belonging. Freedom meant being free from outside control, not free to do whatever you wanted. That's still there underneath. We want to be free, but we also want to be safe. We want to choose, but we also want to belong. That tension is medieval. Now think about the way we think about justice, fairness, right and wrong. We have laws, courts, punishments. We have ideas about what's just and what's not. Those ideas come from thousands of years of thinking, but a lot of them were shaped in the Middle Ages by philosophers, by theologians, by ordinary people arguing about what was fair. Every time you say that's not right, you're appealing to a standard that medieval people helped create. And the way we think about mercy, forgiveness, second chances, that's medieval too. It's Christian. It's about grace, about redemption, about the possibility of change. We may not believe in God anymore, but we still believe people can change. We still hope for forgiveness. We still give second chances. That's medieval. Now let's talk about the way we think about beauty. Art, music, literature, what we like, what we value. Medieval art was religious, symbolic, stylized. We like realism, expression, innovation. But we still respond to the same things: color, form, emotion. We still make art about what matters to us. Every painting, every song, every story is a medieval manuscript where someone tried to capture something beautiful and make it last. And the way we think about truth, what's real, what's true. Medieval people believed in absolute truth, God's truth. We're more skeptical. We think truth is relative, subjective, hard to find. But we still look for it. We still argue about it. We still want to know what's real. That search and that longing for truth is medieval. They just thought they'd found it. Now think about the way we think about doubt. We doubt everything. We question everything. That's modern, we think. But medieval people doubted too. They had crises of faith. They wondered if God was real, if the church was right, if they were saved. They wrote about it, worried about it, struggled with it. Doubt isn't modern, it's human. Every time you wonder if you're doing the right thing, if you believe the right thing, if any of it matters, you're having a medieval moment. And the way we think about despair, hopelessness, that's medieval too. They called it acedia, spiritual sloth. It was a sin. It was giving up. We call it depression. We treat it with drugs, with therapy, but it's the same thing. The feeling that nothing matters, that you can't go on, that it's all pointless. Medieval people knew that feeling. They fought it with prayer, with community, with work. We fight it with different tools, but the fight is the same. Now let's talk about the way we think about joy, happiness, pleasure. Medieval people weren't all gloom and doom. They had fun. They laughed. They danced. They drank. They loved. They celebrated. They enjoyed life. They knew it was short, so they made the most of it. Every time you laugh with friends, every time you enjoy a good meal, every time you feel truly happy, you're doing what medieval people did. You're grabbing a moment of joy in a world that doesn't guarantee it. And the way we think about grief, loss, sorrow, they knew that too. They buried children, spouses, parents. They mourned. They grieved. They comforted each other. Every time you cry at a funeral, every time you miss someone who's gone, you're feeling what medieval people felt. Grief doesn't change. It's the same pain, the same emptiness, the same longing. We just hide it better. Now think about the way we think about hope. Hope for better times. Hope for change. Hope for the future. Medieval people had hope. They hoped for peace, for plenty, for salvation. They hoped their children would do better. They hoped God would be merciful. Hope is what kept them going. It's what keeps us going. Every time you look forward to something, every time you believe things will get better, you're hoping. And that hope is medieval. And the way we think about love, not just romantic love, love for family, for friends, for community, love for God, for country, for humanity. Love is the biggest thing. It's what makes life worth living. Medieval people knew that. They wrote about it, sang about it, died for it. Every time you love someone, every time you care about something beyond yourself, you're doing what medieval people did. You're connecting. You're reaching out. You're being human. Now let's go back to where we started. The emergency fixes, the things they threw together in a panic that became permanent. They're everywhere. In the water we drink, in the money we spend, in the music we hear, in the laws we obey, in the way we think, the way we feel, the way we live. The Middle Ages didn't end. They just became us. We are the descendants of peasants who cleared the forest and plowed the fields. We are the descendants of merchants who crossed the seas and signed the contracts. We are the descendants of monks who copied the books and sang the prayers. We are the descendants of knights who fought the battles and built the castles. We are the descendants of everyone who lived through plague and famine and war, who fixed what was broken, who kept going when everything fell apart. And we're still doing it, every day, fixing what's broken, improvising solutions, making things work. We don't know which of our emergency fixes will become permanent. We don't know what future generations will look back on and say, that's when they started doing that. We just know we have to keep going, keep fixing, keep hoping, because that's what they did. That's what we do. That's what we'll always do. The water rises, the plague comes, the fire burns, the money runs out, the old ways fail, and we panic. We improvise, we fix it, and then we keep going. And 700 years from now, someone will look back at us and say, that's where it started. That emergency fix. The desperate improvisation. A thing we threw together because we had no choice. They'll take it for granted. They'll think it's always been that way. They won't know we were scared. They won't know we were guessing. They won't know we had no idea what we were doing. But we did. We did what we could with what we had. Just like them. Just like the people before them. Just like the people after us. That's the story, and that's always the story. 1,000,000 emergencies. 1,000,000 fixes. 1,000,000 things that became how we do things forever. And it's still happening. Right now. Every day.